Meeting is open. Next item on the agenda is a statement by the Vice President of the Commission, High Representative of the Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, topic of the Syrian regime as geopolitical implications and the humanitarian situation in the region. Welcome, Madam Kallas, to this House. I wish you the best for the next 5 years, and it's my pleasure to give you the floor.
Dear President, honourable members, it's really a pleasure to be here, to see the plenary from this side. It is with a sense of cautious optimism that I address you today as we witness a historic turning point in Syria. The fall of the Assad regime marks the beginning of a new chapter for the Syrian people and a broader Middle East. First, I would like to take a moment to reaffirm that the EU's approach to Syria all these 14 years has been both principled and firm and has proven the right one. We remain true to our values. We hold dear freedom, human rights, inclusiveness, respect for minorities and accountability. We stood with the Syrian people in Syria and the diaspora, organising each year an international conference for the future of Syria. The EU and its member states mobilised more than 33.3 billion in humanitarian, development, economic and stabilisation assistance, providing support both Syrians inside the country and in the region, as well as outside. Assad had proven time and again that there would be never a peaceful, united and stable Syria, nor regional stability under his rule. And his allies, especially Russia and Iran, had used Syria to advance their destabilising strategies hurtful for our key interests. Now there is a historic window of opportunity, and we Europeans need to act decisively and cohesively, also with our key partners. I was in Aqaba on Saturday for the international meeting convened by Jordan, important because it included the key regional actors, the neighbours of Syria, as well as the UN, United States and the European Union. We agreed on principles which are very important to the Syrian people and to all of us: stability, sovereignty, territorial integrity of Syria, Syrian-led and Syrian-owned inclusive political process with the support of the United Nations, government respectful of all components of society, build-up of institutions, but also the fight against Daesh and the destruction of chemical weapons, and finally, accountability for the crimes committed by the Assad regime and others. Yesterday, EU foreign ministers endorsed these key principles and supported my proposal to swiftly design a new approach to Syria. We are already stepping up humanitarian assistance to meet emerging needs. We have a key interest in the success of Syrian transition. We need to adapt our early recovery parameters to the new political reality with a view to eventual reconstruction, to start reflecting on a possible revision of our sanctions regime in order to support Syria's path to recovery while keeping our leverage, and to further support accountability efforts at this crucial juncture in order to lay the foundations for transitional justice and reconciliation. This approach is driven by two objectives: early engagement and prudence. Finally, we must see how the EU, and especially this House, can support the democratic aspirations of Syria. Earlier this year, in May, over 600 Syrian civil society representatives met in the European Parliament in Brussels for the Syria conference. For the 8th year in a row, Brussels was the place, the only one in the world, where Syrians from across the country and the diaspora were able to come together and reflect both concrete issues and how to build a better future. Now, 6 months later, this future of peace, freedom and dignity is closer than ever for all communities, for all people, men, women and children. It is for the Syrians to build, but the EU has much more it can do for its aspirations. And this Parliament has very much to offer. Now, I have instructed my services to start thinking about what the 9th Brussels Conference on the future of Syria and the region could look like, this time in a new Syria. I look forward to also European Parliament's contribution. In conclusion, this is a critical moment for Syria and for the international community. The European Union has been consistent in its tireless efforts in supporting Syrian people, and we must continue to do so. Together, we can help shape a future for peace, security and justice prevail for Syria and its people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Kallas. First place, on behalf of the EPP Group, Mr. Galler, you have the floor.
Ja, vielen Dank, Herr Präsident.
Thank you very much, President, Vice President, High Representative. First of all, on behalf of the EPP, I'd like to wish you all the best for your new position here. On the big issues where we have broad consensus, you will have our support. Now, I think here, in this situation, we can be relieved, together with the Syrians, that one of the most brutal regimes in the world has come to an end. And it can be seen that this is a strategic defeat for Russia and Iran as well. This terror axis in Syria, where cities and towns have been bombed with the help of the Russians, and then the Russians are continuing their war in Ukraine. Now, it's good that, for example, today the Commission President is in Ankara to speak to one of the major players in the region, Turkey, to look at how cooperation should continue. And I expect Turkey not to respond with bombs to these new developments. I believe that the Syrian Kurds do not want to work for the PKK. No, they are well organized in Syria. We should recognize this, and we should allow Syrian Kurds to make a contribution to stabilizing the country. We have a lot more to say, but I don't have any speaking time left. Thank you.
Mr. Galler, on behalf of the Socialists and the Democrats, Mr. Maniatis.
Dear colleagues, last week the sudden fall of Assad, a brutal dictator, and this brought lots of hope to Syrian citizens. In less than a week, Hayat Tahrir and its leader, al-Jolani, came to power. But no one can be certain that this switch can actually lead to a democratic, inclusive and open Syria, or whether it could be substituted by a new brutal regime. So the jihadist past of HTS and its roots in al-Qaeda and ISIS that led to it being listed under terrorist organizations do not allow us to feel safe about this and to sit idly by. And we already have the first signs of the new regime not being really inclusive. We cannot allow Syria to evolve into a second Afghanistan on the Mediterranean. And we cannot allow ISIS to come back to life. We need to protect the rich cultural history of Syria, including, of course, Christians. We also need to make sure that all minorities, such as the Kurds, will have an equal footing in designing the future. The Turks are supporting certain troops, and this needs to stop. there is a risk of a civil war starting again, and this could have unforeseen circumstances. The civil war has left a country in tatters. The EU has an interest but also a duty to be substantially present in the area and to co-determine the next day. The East Med is our neighborhood, it's our home. We cannot allow this to fall into other people's hands. Thank you.
Dear colleague, on behalf of the Patriots for Europe, Mr. Bardella.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. The brutal, bloodthirsty dictator has fallen, and it's the heirs of Daesh and al-Qaeda who have taken over. We're seeing a new chapter in the history of Syria, but al-Jolani's Syria risks being as dark as the previous one. According to some Western foreign offices, the new rulers are fighters for freedom, but we probably will see terror, Christians are being oppressed, and stability still doesn't exist. Unfortunately, it shouldn't be necessary to recall it here, but Islamism is a monster that exists in Africa, the Middle East, and in Europe, as well as in Molenbeek, Rotterdam, etc. It has activists, militants, and networks everywhere. Europe seems to be blind to the attacks of Islamists during recent decades, and we can't remain passive while we watch this conflict play out. It's important for our future. If we have Islamists sustainably in power in Syria, we could see a new migration crisis and terror crisis, and that will affect us here in Europe. There is a jihadi danger there. We need to put Europe first. We need to ensure that we protect Europeans. Suspending the assessment of asylum requests, working to return Syrian refugees and strengthening Europe's borders are crucial for our future. Our security and European security depends on it.
Sí, Monsieur Bardella. Next speaker, Mr. Bilan, on behalf of the ECR group.
Thank you, Mr. President. First of all, let me express deepest condolences to the Syrian people who lost hundreds of thousands of lives during the 13 years of destructive tyranny and bloody retaliation that followed the Arab Spring, orchestrated by Putin's puppet Bashar al-Assad. It is euphemism to say that the change of regime is already having massive repercussions in the regions. Russia's and Iran's failed states are suffering a strategic defeat, and others, regional and global players, are already playing their next hands. Europe must stand prepared to support Syrians in their pursuit of political transition. This includes robust humanitarian assistance, the promotion of inclusive dialogue among all legitimate stakeholders, and the reinforcement of accountability measures for war crimes. In parallel, we must support the new Syrian government capacity building, ensuring that the population can safely remain in their homeland and preventing any further destabilization in the country. And last but not least, we cannot forget about Christians who can be in danger right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, dear colleague. On behalf of the Renew Group, Madame Loisson.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. High Representative, Bashar al-Assad has been toppled. The message is strong, and it goes for all dictators. None of you are eternal. And this also applies to all regimes that are supported by Russia. Putin is not a trustworthy ally. Al-Assad has been toppled. We have seen those that have been liberated. We know now and we see now what exactly was going on, the barbaric acts in Bashar al-Assad's Syria, including those, for example, from the RN that shook hands with the butcher of Damascus. We find that shameful now. Hope, uncertainty, Islamist rebels took Damascus. That is of concern, specifically the Christians in Syria. All of the components of Syria must find their rightful place in a new Syria. Turkey has been bombing areas and the Kurds. They must join us in fighting IS. Fighting terrorism must continue. We must also commit to this new Syria, review sanctions, look to rebuilding and recalling our priorities, fighting terrorism, destruction of chemical weapons, respect of our neighbors, end of the alliance with Russia, protection of minorities, and room for women. With these conditions in place, the birth of a new Syria can be good news for the Middle East. Thank you, Madame Loiseau.
I give the floor to Madame Neumann.
Yalla, Ahaya Bashar, get out Bashar. That's what Syrians shouted in 2014, and now he is a refugee in Moscow. No one knows exactly what this new time will bring for Syria, but for the first time in decades, my Syrian friends have hope. Hope to rebuild their country, and I want the European Union to support them with humanitarian aid, with their fight against impunity, and with crystal clear political signals that Europe will support all those committed to Syrian-led process in the spirit of Resolution 2254. And when we talk to HTS, the message needs to be crystal clear. It's not about protecting women and minorities. It's about building a government where they sit at the table like everyone else. And to get there, dear colleagues, we also need to revisit our debates on asylum, Mr. Badella. While Syrians celebrated the end of Assad's reign, while families were searching in Sidnaya's ruins for their loved ones, some in here had no other thought than how fast can we get rid of Syrians. But colleagues, can we please remember that Syrians are human beings like you and me? Would you uproot your family right now to bring them to an unstable, violent country? Or would you want to go first and just assess the situation? That's exactly what Syrians want to do, and it's in our interest to let them. To build a democratic Syria, we need those that fled Assad on the ground. To rebuild Syria, we need entrepreneurs to invest and travel to the countries, and forced returns, dear colleagues, won't happen for another year or two at least. So why don't we let Syrians travel to Syria to sort things out, and upon return decide with their families on the best way to go ahead? Our current asylum rules prevent them to do exactly this. This is why we need temporary exceptions in our interest and in theirs. Dear colleagues, I refuse to give up the hope for a democratic Syria just because some in here fuel toxic asylum debates. Let's stand with Syrians to rebuild a country that heals its wounds and is a free country for everyone.
Thank you very much, dear colleague. On behalf of the left, Mr. Schiederman.
Vielen Dank, Herr Präsident.
Thank you, President. High Representative. Assad has fallen and fled into the arms of his war buddy Putin. And we've seen joy during recent days on the streets of Syria and also on the streets of Europe. The future of Syria is open, however. The new leader of Syria, al-Jolani, is a wanted Islamist with a $10 million bounty on his head, and his militia, HTS, is listed as a terror organisation by the UN. And it's pure racist hypocrisy now to start speaking about how we can send Syrians back as quickly as possible after they fled 14 endless years of civil war. Germany took in 1 million Syrian war refugees. Many of them are working in important jobs like in the health sector and in the traffic sector. Germany needs these workers. We need these people who have become friends and neighbours for many people. The times in which the EU played an important role in the Middle East are long gone because the EU has lost all its foreign policy credibility. And now we're seeing unbearable double standards appearing. The silence of the Commission against the war that Turkey has been waging against Kurdistan is deafening. And the same goes for the violation of the ceasefire and the occupation, which is against international law, of further Syrian areas by Israel. Erdogan is a dictator who continues to dream about a greater Ottoman Empire. He works with Islamist militias that enslave women and children, and Turkey is not far behind Islamic State in its desire to wipe out Kurds and Yazidis. We have heard Slava Ukraini many times during recent years, but it would have been good to hear Biji Rojava as well. The Kurds defeated Islamic State, and we should be grateful. The Turks should stop their war against Kurdistan immediately. The EU should recognise the democratically independent administration in the north and east of Syria and should take up bilateral diplomatic relations with them. That would be credible European foreign policy. And we need a decisive signal from the EU on the recognition of a Palestinian state, because the key to peace in the Middle East lies in the solution of the Palestinian question. Israel must stop the war in Gaza, stop causing death and suffering among the Palestinian civilian population, and it should stick to international humanitarian law. The Israeli hostages must be released immediately by Hamas. We need a safe and sovereign Israel, but a safe and sovereign Israel requires a safe and sovereign Palestine by its side. Otherwise, we'll never see peace in the Middle East. Thank you.
On behalf of the Europe of Sovereign Nations Group, Mr. Ulrich.
Colleagues, a short while ago I saw some shocking video from Germany where thousands of Syrian migrants were marching in the Christmas market and they were shouting Allahu Akbar. Thousands of Syrian migrants walking in the Christmas market. There were nice Christmas trees everywhere, decorations, children happy that Christmas is coming up. And I'm asking you, is this the Europe that you want, so that people are afraid to go visit the Christmas market? But now we have a chance to change things. You're saying that a democratic government is coming up in Syria. Okay, let's try it. It's high time, so that as the EU helped migrants enter the EU territory, now we can help them to go back home. All those young men shouting in European cities, all those migrants who left their women and children behind, they left them in the war and they fled to Europe. Let's help them go back home. Let's do this. It's a good deed. Let's help them tidy up from Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we jump in the second part of our debate. First speaker, Madame Terlac. You have the floor.
Dank u, voorzitter, beste collega's.
Thank you. Thank you, President. Colleagues, well, we can only imagine the atrocities and difficulties that have taken place in Syria over the past few years of dictatorship, with scars which will remain. And there are many unanswered questions about the new regime. But we should be optimistic, and we should give this state the opportunity to become a legitimate state. A new constitution needs to be put in place which gives rights to all Syrians, whether it's about women, ethnic minorities or religious minorities. The European Union needs to focus on the rule of law in giving assistance. We need to build diplomatic relations, and we should also ensure that our embassies can be opened in Syria. Europe must guarantee peace. The time for change has come, and the European Union needs to maintain its links and guarantee stability in the region. Thank you.
Mr. Tarquinio.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, President. High Representative. Well, Assad's brutal regime has gone, and that's enough to give us hope. But the path towards peace, security and democracy in Syria is an uncertain and long one, as you said. And so we need a strong diplomatic commitment from the EU. We need to put pressure on, with all the instruments we have available, on the transition government so that they can launch, guarantee and respect a democratic process which is based on respect for the rule of law, equality between men and women, and fundamental rights for the entire population of Syria, all the different ethnic groups from wherever they come. If we really believe that all the people should be involved in the position of transition in a Syria that remains territorially whole, we can only be astonished at some of the actions by member states. I mean, stopping processing asylum requests from Syrians is crazy. It's not a peaceful state. What we need to do is increase humanitarian aid, because people and communities are in a dramatic situation in Syria. We need new flexible rules as well on asylum, which enables Syrians who are currently in the European Union to go back to their country of origin to contribute to the transition process without risking losing their status as refugees in Europe. And finally, a lot's been said about Iranian and Russian influence on Assad's Syria. Well, yes, some things need to be dealt with. I hope that you'll remind Turkey and Israel as well that international law can never be broken. The EU really needs to stand up to for these challenges. Thank you.
Mr. Tahrir, you have the floor.
Señor Presidente.
President, Madam High Representative, Vice President of the Commission, a message that I should like to send to you. You do not have easy work in the work with Syria, we know that we have a terrorist remains a terrorist, and we should never forget that. And so look at what Syria is facing now, is they have terrorists and many other countries that are interested in garnering power there. And then we have a geopolitical situation. We have other forces also that do not want to lose their clout with an agreement. We know that we have Muslims that are underpinning some of the terrorist forces. And so things are going to be extremely complicated, very difficult to bring the humanitarian aid that is much needed. And we can never let that be far from our mind. So I'd also like to state that if the European Union, once and for all, in this area, does not look at the problems clearly and does not make progress, it will completely lose its credibility. And we have to look at the situation with clarity. So, Madam Commissioner, we know that we often have the saying parole, parole. Words are just words, but we have to be a trustworthy partner and one that they can count on. Thank you very much.
Madam Gambino. No, sorry. You have the floor. Monsieur.
President, Vice President, congratulations on your new job. Colleagues, the fall of the Assad regime is historic, and it's a crucial time for Syria and, in fact, for the Middle East as a whole. Europe is responsible for guiding this transition, avoiding the errors made in the past, in Iraq and Libya, for example, because a lack of a clear strategy there left chaos in those countries. It's now crucial to recall that the stability of Syria also depends on the surrounding region, in particular on Jordan, which is already suffering the consequences of the crisis. The recent statement from President von der Leyen, when she expressed the European Union's full support to Jordan, is a clear sign as to how the European Union is going to work closely with countries that border Syria to guarantee an orderly transition in line with Resolution 2254 of the UN Security Council. An unstable Syria is a time bomb for the rest of the region, not only in terms of migration, but also because terrorist groups can go from Syria to Europe and elsewhere. Europe needs to be firm here. We need to show a commitment to humanitarian law, human rights, and we need to work with Jordan to build a better situation. I'm sure that you'll be able to work, Madam Vice President, with the Parliament to ensure that this transition is as democratic as possible. Thank you.
The next speaker is Madame Boutmans. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Colleagues, the West has failed to prevent the Syrian tragedy. The West has failed to protect itself and create security for the Europeans. Since the outbreak of the Arab Spring, neither we nor the Americans have done anything substantial to support the Syrian people or to oust Bashar al-Assad. The horrifying images of the Setnaya prison will remain etched in everyone's memory. We must not make the same mistake again and show some backbone. What we do or fail to do can make an enormous difference. The difference between stability or chaos. The difference between Syrian refugees returning home or even more Syrian refugees coming to Europe. My proposal is that you do two very concrete actions. One, engage in dialogue with the new power brokers. No hesitation. At the highest level, Kaya, not like the Council said. Do it at your level. Only political pressure can prevent them to radicalize. And secondly, organize a global donor conference for the reconstruction of Syria. Take the lead, because, let's be honest, we did nothing when the Syrian revolution broke out on March 15, 2011. We did nothing to support the democratic opposition. We left the field to ISIS, Iran and Russia, to murderers and terrorists. Do the opposite of what the Orban regime is asking you, and you will be on the right side of history. Thank you very much.
Dear Madame Baumann, sorry, Madam. You have a blue card from Mr. Gratsoulis from ESN Group. Do you accept it?
Yes.
Mr. Gratsoulis, you have 30 seconds.
Wait. I don't hear you.
Dear Speaker, you have just said that Europe has done little in order to overthrow Assad. But now, when his regime has collapsed, for some reason, Israel, the American forces and European forces have started bombing every day. Is this a help to the new government who have come to power and overthrown Assad? Children are dying, people are dying, infrastructure is being destroyed, and Europe is silent. What is your evaluation of this situation?
Well, honestly, I think you didn't listen to my speech, because that was exactly what I'm saying. Europe cannot wait. We have to take the lead. We have to engage with the new people who are in power there and talk to them at the highest political level. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, your colleague. Our next speaker is Mr. Sautori. You have the floor.
Monsieur le Président. President, High Representative, a special envoy, and 60 million euros in aid, but that is not enough considering the scale of chaos in Syria. We're talking about 50 years of oppression. We're talking about people being forced to exile to not be tortured or killed. We're talking about the fact that we have to document the truth and responsibility of what veritably went down in the country. Now, I'm calling on international justice to protect all evidence and to conserve it. Justice is a prerequisite to peace, and it is today that we need to make sure the conditions are in place for it to be put into place in a free and democratic Syria. for the democratic transition, and diplomatic relations must be reestablished as quickly as possible. We must be demanding in terms of human rights, and specifically in respecting the rights of women and children and minorities. Now, I have a specific thought for the Kurdish people, where they will have a determining role, that have had a determining role in fighting IS. We also need to protect the Syrian sovereignty from the Israeli actions. We also need to make sure that we are fighting the discourse of the hard right.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Madame Kallas, nouvelle ministre.
Thank you, President. Mrs. Kallas, new High Representative for Foreign Affairs of the European Union. Well, you're quite right to criticise the Russian presence in Syria, but you don't criticise the US or Israeli presence. You talk about a free Syria, but you accept the fact that your Israeli and American allies occupy a part of the country. How can you build a free country under occupation? I mean, you talk about an independent Syria, but you're quite happy for the Americans to control the oil and the Israelis destroy the Syrian army. How can you build an independent country without oil and without an army? You say you want to help the Syrians, but for a decade now, the European Union has been destroying the Syrian economy via sanctions. Acts speak louder than words, High Representative, and I think we have to say that Europe is not working for a strong, independent Syria. It's working for a weak, divided country, a country that can be exploited by our multinational businesses, as is the case for so many other countries in the regions. Gas, oil, geopolitics, Europe only defends the interests of its multinational companies now, and everything else is just for the audience. Thank you.
Mr. Schell, you have the floor.
Deutschlands Innenministerin ist besorgt.
The Interior Minister of Germany is worried. But Nancy Faeser is not bothered about Islamists coming to Germany. She's concerned about Syria because more than 1 million Syrians came to Germany, including war criminals and Islamists. And we had fighters for the IS in a case in Germany. In Hamburg as well, there's a court case as well. And in Frankfurt, there's been a case involving rape. 100,000 offences committed by Syrians in Germany in recent years. They have sought a home in Germany and they've received allowances and they've received healthcare from the German state. I am concerned that more of those people will come to Germany, into the all-inclusive resort for Islamists and war criminals from the whole of the world. First of all, we need to close the borders. Second, deport. And thirdly, we cannot support the new regime in Damascus.
Laudetur Jesus Christus. God bless everybody, Syrians and all the others. The question is, who's next? Who's next that you are going to nominate for a bad guy? Somebody to be erased, delegitimized, somebody that you want to help, rob, kill. Who's next? Because as long as I'm listening to your debates here, each and every time you nominate somebody, you nominate Russia, obviously, China, North Korea, Iran, Syria, Georgia, Moldova, Romania. These are the countries that you don't like. You want to take Europe to war. All along you were being grotesque with your warmongering. Now you're being more and more dangerous to the people of Europe and to the people of the world. So, who's next, Madam Commissary, that you are going to nominate?
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Mr. McAllister.
Mr. President, thank you for giving me the floor. Madam Vice President, High Representative, great to see you here sitting in the plenary. As we have heard this morning, the reaction to the fall of Bashar al-Assad has been relief, also at yesterday's Foreign Affairs Council, and rightly so. This dictator and his regime are responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, far more than ISIS and all other so-called rebels combined. And indeed, the fall of Mr. Assad represents a significant loss for Iran. Assad's Syria was, alongside Hezbollah, a key component of Iran's so-called axis of resistance. Through Assad, it was the Mullah regime that was able to project its power across the Middle East. And the same far-reaching consequences apply for Mr. Putin. Beyond the blow to this axis of terror, as my colleague Michael Gahler just named it, let us not underestimate the enormous new challenges the transition carries within Syria. The rebels are led by the jihadist militia HTS, which is an extremist group that has its origins in the Islamic State and was allied with al-Qaeda. Mr. al-Jolani is now confronted with the enormous task of bringing peace to Syria in an inclusive process that respects the voices of all religious and ethnic minorities, whether it be Alawites, Christians, Druze, Shiites or Kurds. Relief and concern are not a contradiction, but rather the foundation for a reasonable policy towards the realities and uncertainties of the entire region. There is also room for hope. The European Union should not allow a vacuum in Syria. Let us engage and try to stabilize the country and constructively reach out to other powers which have sway in the country. Madam Kallas, I am glad to see you are already working exactly to this end. Thank you.
Dear President of the AFET Committee, nuestra siguiente oradora es la señora Pajín. Tiene usted el...
The next speaker is Madam Pajín. You have 1.5 minutes.
Gracias, señor Presidente.
Thank you, President. Welcome, Madam Kallas. Now, we would like to go back, but we are afraid. And the question is, going back to what or to where? These are the words of a woman with her husband and 2 children who have disabilities and who left homes because of the brutal dictatorship in the country. Today, in their family, they are in a refugee camp in Lebanon, much like other millions of Syrians in the region. The region, again, anyone who is trying to use this debate for hate speech, just try to think for a second, where is your humanity? Now, we have seen that this is one of the worst crises that we've had in our times. We've had 13 million displaced. Half of the Syrian population has needed urgent humanitarian aid. In terms of the crisis that we have, the EU should be decisive with urgent humanitarian aid and not have a temptation to reduce in terms of quantity. Now, we have seen that the EU has made statements and commitments in these last few days, but we must sustain them over time. The EU and the international community shan't forget the Syrian people in just a couple weeks or months' time. The EU must work with all parties to guarantee the state and the future and the access to humanitarian aid. It is true that, as the High Representative said, this is a time of hope, but we have to make sure that we are up to the task of making that a reality, and we must place that at the core of our action, this humanitarian action. Let us stop speaking about figures and start talking about people.
Tarjeta.
Madam Pajín, you have a blue card.
Del señor Tinkinen del Grupo ECR.
From Mr. Tinkinen from the ECR Group. Would you accept it?
Sí.
Mr. Tinkinen.
Yes.
2 seconds.
Kiitoksia puheenjohtaja. Thank you, President, esteemed member. When the war began and people started fleeing Syria, it was said that it would be important to protect these people as long as the situation remains the same. Now that the al-Assad regime has been toppled, many are in a very well-founded way thinking that it would be the right time to go back home. You, on the other hand, were talking about the fact that we are using the situation the situation is being used to bring forward hate speech. How is it possible to build Syria from outside? I believe that the Syrians who go back to Syria will be able to reconstruct the country and that they are needed. Thank you.
Now, sir, today, in the past, and always, we need access to humanitarian aid for all individuals in an equal way. And we need to stop sowing hate and using human tragedy to sow hate in our society, as you have done in the past. And we should stop availing of situations that are so devastating for others. We must stand in solidarity and build new hope for the Syrian people, guarantee humanitarian aid, and guarantee a future of hope for the Syrian people.
The next speaker is Mr. Rago. You have the floor.
Thank you, President. High Representative, the fall of Assad's dictatorship could have represented hope for the Syrian people, but the risk is that it will enter even deeper chaos. We have seen Islamist militia start to take control. How can we not be horrified in the face of this situation? These men, women and children, religious minorities, especially Christians, are facing a dark future. The cultural heritage of Syria is being destroyed. But then what about Western powers? For example, France. They are celebrating the victory of rebels, but these are Islamists. And there is no such thing as moderate Islamism. Examples from Iraq, Iran and Libya. Perhaps if we looked at those and remembered those, we wouldn't be so naive. And we'll see mass migration as well, and violence in Europe. Europe needs to react with a clear head and in a firm manner, but we also need to protect our external borders. And then, coming back to the European Migration Pact, this wants to force automatic distribution of mass migration. It's a duty to our people to combat these threats. We also need to support the forces that fight Islam and protect persecuted minorities, and we need to ensure that asylum claims are dealt with outside the EU. This is our minimum security obligation in an international context of significant instability that the world is facing. Thank you.
Mr. Giadi, you have the floor.
Things in Syria are chaotic. This is a very fragmented landscape. Therefore, Commissioner, we cannot be optimistic or complacent. We might have witnessed the fall of a dictatorship, but we might have another equally extremist, equally Islamist dictatorship. The HTS transitional government, let me remind you that it has been listed as a terrorist organization by the State Department since 2014. The fact that in many European cities we saw flags of the Free Syrian Army being brandished that is closely linked to the Islamist State is something that is very worrisome. And especially for my country, Cyprus, this is very worrying since Turkey is behind the new regime. So I would like to raise the alarm. Since the worries of so many Syrian immigrants here in Europe have stopped to exist, now they should return to the country. We need to be proactive. We cannot allow illegal migration to become a fifth column in our European countries.
Madame Strack-Zimmermann, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Hohe Vertreterin, es ist mir eine Freude.
High Representative, it's a great pleasure to see you here today. Well, we were happy when we heard that Assad had gone. Hopefully he'll be happy in Moscow. But I think we need to reflect on what Europe's done during recent years. How could we end up with this vacuum? How could we see Russia move in that way and support the brutal Assad. I mean, we know what Russia gets up to. We've seen it in Ukraine as well. So Europe now has an opportunity to help to achieve stability in Syria. I mean, that would be a good thing for Europe too. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll see whether the Islamists genuinely want to work for the future of Syria rather than suppress people, as has taken place in Afghanistan. Europe can make a contribution, also a diplomatic one, and we could help Syrians rebuild their homeland, and the Syrians who are in Europe could help to be a bridge between the two continents. But Europe needs to be present in Syria. And, High Representative, I'm sure that you're the right person to represent Europe on the world stage and in the Middle East. Thank you.
From Madame de Mirel from the left. Do you accept it?
Hier.
Madame de Mirel, you have the floor.
Wir können Deutsch sprechen. Das machen wir doch gerne.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Strack-Zimmerman. Thank you for taking the blue card. Now, I would say that the Syrian people long for equality, democracy, peace and justice. They have been through too much suffering. For decades now, in Syria, it's not only large powers like Russia and the US who have been active, it's also Turkey that's sending in jihadis. Israel's been bombing various areas. And Germany has, with its government, been involved in delivering weapons to Israel for months now, and they're proud of it. And Germany is also the speaker is interrupted by the president. So how are you going to contribute to stability in the region by delivering weapons? Thank you very much. You've spoken for a long time, says Ms. Strack-Zimmerman, without asking a question. But the situation is very complex, and Europe needs to play an appropriate role, which it hasn't been doing during recent years. All of those involved need to sit down around a table. And when it comes to Israel, Israel suffered bombardment from Syria for decades and has now been destroying chemical weapons supplies to ensure that they don't fall into the hands of Islamists, so that they can no longer be used for the purposes that Assad was using them for. I'm sure that Mrs. Kallas is the right person to represent Europe and help to bring peace. And I think we agree on the fact that people need peace, they need security, and they need the opportunity to live in peace and freedom as we have in Europe, regardless of which religion they profess. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Madame Strick.
Hi, Representative, welcome. After 50 years of repression, escalated in a 13 years long brutal war, the Assad regime has fallen. Finally, Syrian citizens have a chance at building a safe and free country, and the EU must do everything in its power to help make that really happen, and also to hold the Assad regime accountable. But we're still far from true celebration. Look at the unstable situation, the unlawful attacks by regional actors, and the level of destruction. Yet EU countries who often take years to decide on asylum claims now rush to premature decisions, freezing asylum examinations and even announcing deportations of Syrians. This is harming Syrian people who cannot return in safety now and are still entitled to protection. But it also sends a dangerous signal to neighbouring countries like Turkey and Lebanon. A sudden massive return now can only further destabilise the country. So what the Syrians need is full support, safety and protection wherever they are. They have suffered enough. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam. Mr. Georgiou.
Kyria Kallas.
Ms. Kallas. Dictator Assad has finally fallen, and celebrations have erupted, like in Iraq and Libya. Of course, we saw the consequences for the peoples of those countries. So those who were considered to be terrorists until yesterday and cold-blooded murderers, and now they have been rebaptized, rechristened as guarantors of freedom and peace. But for years, the EU was silent. Of course, it was not Ukraine, it was a different country. But this is the stuff of nightmares. There is a clear risk of the country being torn into pieces. Russians, Americans, Turks that are striking targets, Kurdish targets. Israel that wants to invade and create the greater Israel. The EU, as usual, is absent. So you should do the minimum. You should assist the Syrian people by deciding themselves about the future.
You have the floor.
Уважаеми колеги, colleagues, I don't know whether you've noticed this, but the state of Syria has died. In its place, there is a melting pot of militant jihadists, Kurds, Druze, and all sorts of agents of foreign interests. This explosive combo was created by the US, Turkey, Israel, and Great Britain. Generally, every time a so-called civilized country decides to mend the situation in what it calls uncivilized countries, we witness a total breakdown and many people die. 20 years ago, the US promised to democratize Iraq, but instead assisted the creation of ISIS. Then the West decided to democratize Libya, but instead opened Europe's gates for hundreds of thousands of illegal immigrants. Today, the same Western civilizers took a jihadist, Mohammed al-Jolani, removed his garments, cut his beard, and proclaimed him a liberal Mother Teresa. And they're telling us how civilized he's become. Once upon a time, the US treated Osama bin Laden in the same fatherly manner because the US was sure that he would always carry out their orders. We all know what that led to. I don't think it's going to be any different today.
Grazie.
Thank you. The voice that is rising out of this parliament is one that is obviously dreaming and hoping for rule of law in Syria, but we know that the path is extremely difficult. We have divisions, huge ones within the country, and huge division even amongst all of those who are outside of the country and who have chosen their interlocutor in that huge splintering of society. Now, it's true that everyone picks their preferred ally, and so that's going to be extremely difficult, dear Vice President. And when it comes to risks, there is a specific one: two stakeholders in Syria that have divided, and that is Russia and Turkey. But between the two, there's a huge difference. Russia is not our ally. It recently invaded a non-EU country, and Turkey is our ally in NATO and invaded an EU country, Cyprus. So we have to decide with whom shall we stand for peace in Syria, understanding that Russia and Turkey, divided on all things, have one point that they agree on: damage Europe. So that is the trickiest issue that we'll have to work on. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Mr. Assis.
Muito obrigado, Sr. Presidente.
Thank you very much, President. Madam Commissioner, Vice President, colleagues. Now, the images that we have seen from Syria show the worst evil that humans are capable of, from emerging from these prisons. Now, unfortunately, we don't necessarily move from evil to good. What is happening in Syria is extremely complex. So for the future of optimism, we have to look forward with hope. The paths are now dividing. That is clear. And one thing is improbable, is that there would be a tolerant, multi-ethnic country. Now, what is, however, possible, but that we don't want, is the descending into authoritarianism. Now, if we look at what is happening, we hope that the Syrian people will be able to freely choose what they would like, and no other people, no other states that are going to choose on behalf of the Syrian people, and that it would just be a pawn in the geopolitical chess table. Now, if we look at the rebels that have taken power, they have given statement for a managed transition, but we must support that and ask how exactly are they going to respect the religious minorities and lead to peaceful coexistence? Will they be able to do that? Will they be able to tame the war and not use chemical weapons against civilians without any defense? And how can we make sure that humanitarian aid gets to the civilian population? Lest we forget, Syria is destroyed, and so one of our major functions shall be to support Syria in its process for rebuilding. Thank you.
Speaker is Mr. Van der Riese.
Voorzitter, collega's, Syrië.
Thank you very much, President. Colleagues, Syria urgently needs doctors and engineers, those that came as asylum seekers to Europe. Syria needs its refugees. Right to asylum is not a permanent thing. Those who have sought asylum should return to their homes once it is possible. And it's time now for those people to return to their home country. And that's what Syria is asking for. Syria needs all of these people to rebuild the country. Tens of thousands of refugees who could return to Syria and who should return to Syria. Those who have come to Europe and who want to stay here benefit from our social security systems. These asylum seekers should understand what their role is in the reconstruction of their country. It's an essential role, and return these people is an obligation for us, but it's also a moral obligation for them. All of these asylum seekers who are undergoing ongoing procedures should have these procedures stopped. It's the time for them to return, and this should be done without discussions, no excuses, no exceptions.
Speaker is Mr. Tinnikkinen. You have the floor.
Mr. President, after years of war in Syria, Assad's criminal regime collapsed in just 11 days. The years have been devastating. Since the start of the civil war, around 4.5 million Syrians have fled to Europe. We have witnessed a massive wave of people making their way to this continent, but now we are in a new situation. Many European countries have already ceased processing asylum applications from Syrians. Some are offering money to Syrian refugees to encourage voluntary returns. Times are changing. Syria might not be anymore a country to flee from. When this is confirmed, what's next? It is time for returns. I encourage you Syrians in Europe, return with pride and build a brighter tomorrow for your own country. Thank you.
Thank you, dear colleague. Mr. Barna, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will speak in Romanian. Căderea regimului Assad în Siria reprezintă un moment.
The fall of the Assad regime in Syria is an extremely important moment for the country and the region. For the victims of this brutal dictatorship, we need to recognize the immense suffering that they have experienced. I myself was born in a dictatorship, and I respect and admire the will of this people in the face of difficulties which are impossible to imagine for those who live in democracy. However, at this time, we must recognize that Syria's future is very fragile, and examples in the region don't give cause for much hope. This is the first step towards peace and stability, which are very much needed, but it's a very difficult path. The European Union has a crucial role to play in this process. We must be involved in smart regional diplomacy, promoting dialogue and cooperation to help rebuild Syria. We also need to commit to providing humanitarian aid to Syria. There are many examples from recent history which show us how important it is that Syria must not slide back into chaos. Together we can help build a society based on justice, democracy and human rights, even though this may appear to be a utopia. This is the first test for new European diplomacy, and the President has interrupted the Speaker.
Thank you, President, High Representative. Efter al-Assad-familjens järngrepp i 50 år har regimen äntligen fallit. En stor glädje för världen.
We have had the Assad regime in place for a long time, but it's now fallen, and that leads to a great deal of uncertainty as well as hope. Many Syrians came to Europe. They've been coming for 15 years now, and many of them now have friends, a job, their children are in school, and now they're supposed to leave their new life behind to go back to a country in which Islamists are in power. And that's unthinkable. I mean, certainly some of them will want to go home to their country of origin. Many people, though, have understood what it means to live in freedom in Europe, and they want to do the same thing in Syria. Refugees, however, who are going to go back to Syria are going to have to make a contribution to rebuilding the country during a very uncertain time. We're also going to have to make sure that the funding is available to rebuild the country. But the most important thing is to build democracy so that people can be safe. Thank you.
Arvoisa puhemies,
President, the fall of dictator al-Assad and his regime brings joy and relief for all Syrians and the whole world. However, the future of Syria remains a matter of great concern. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham's commitment to women's rights and democracy are big question marks. Turkey and Israel are exploiting the situation for illegal territorial gains. Turkey is now attacking Kurds in the self-governing region of Rojava and arming Islamist groups for this purpose. The EU must put pressure on these countries to immediately stop their illegal activities in Syria. Now, as it appears that the EU is in formal contact with the new Syrian regime, recognition of Rojava's self-government must be a condition. When discussing the future of Syria, Kurds should be involved as a party both nationally and internationally. The international community must not turn its back on the Kurds, who have fought with great sacrifice in the region for equality against ISIS terrorism.
Thank you very much, dear colleague. Next speaker, Mr. Fröhlich.
Die Ära Assad ist beendet.
The era of Assad has come to an end, and there's a reason to be happy. But if we look at al-Jolani, he is an Islamist, and the fact that people are celebrating this shows just how morally bankrupt our elites are. And this is somebody with millions of dollars of bounty on his head. And in the worst case scenario, this could be a second Libya with another civil war. This could be a nightmare, especially for our Christian brothers in the Levant. But for us, it means even more mass migration. Europe is geopolitically impotent, and here we could see more conflict, and it's therefore a catastrophe. And what we need to do is deport Syrians. Their homeland needs them. Our boat is full. We can't deal with this. And otherwise, we will have a Syrian civil war here right in Europe. Thank you.
Mr. Papadakis. You have the floor.
The imperialist invasion and the planned partition of the sovereign state of Syria has all been planned in the Middle East by the US, the EU, NATO, Turkey, and Israel. And it comes, it's closely linked to the genocide in Palestine by the state of Israel, attacks against Lebanon, and threats against Iran. The US, the EU, and the Greek government have welcomed the toppling of the Syrian regime by the jihadists and are now calling them rebels and guarantors of democratic transition. There is a lot separating us, of course, from the capitalist regime of Assad, but from the first moment we condemned this invasion and revisionist tendencies, but you only speak against Russia while you're turning a blind eye when it comes to the US, Turkey, and Israel that have invaded Syria. So we need to stand in solidarity with the Syrian people and against imperialism.
You have the floor, sir.
Muchas gracias, presidente. Bienvenido.
Thank you, President. Welcome, High Representative. Now, we can welcome the falling of a dictator and the toppling of al-Assad, who had crimes, torture, displaced people. And the first thing would be to obviously congratulate all European Democrats. The second thing is that we're seeing that there's a redefining of the geopolitical, geostrategic map in the Middle East. Now, nothing that seems to be the truth is the truth in the Middle East, and with friends and enemies switching on a daily basis. Moreover, many world powers have clear interests in the area. In the face of this, the EU, we can see, obviously, the uncertainty that persists there now with the toppling and with the Salafist Islamism and violation of human rights. We must be very cautious and prudent as we approach the situation. We must demand, as the High Representative stated, the territorial integrity of Syria, respect for human rights, guarantee the independence and sovereignty of the territory, and assist those who have been displaced that are suffering the most by increasing our humanitarian aid. We should not open a debate within 24 hours' time following the toppling of how the individuals should be returned to the country. What we should look at now is a democratic regime that respects religious and racial minorities as we wait for further events to unfold. Thank you.
You have the floor.
Thank you, President. High Representative, colleagues. Well, we don't yet know what's going to happen in Syria after the fall of the butcher Assad, but we know the scope of the crisis that was already underway. It's a devastated country that needs to be rebuilt. 16 million people, two-thirds of them children, who need humanitarian assistance. There's a mosaic of ethnic and religious minorities that require respect and would like autonomy, like the Kurds, who, having helped us fight Islamic State, now risk being targeted by Turks and radical groups at the same time. From the start of the civil war, half the Syrian population have had to leave their homes, and 7 million of them are internally displaced, and 6 million of them are refugees or asylum seekers abroad. Are they all in Europe? Absolutely not. 3/4 of the refugees are in countries that border Syria, 3 million just in Turkey, and during recent months, 500,000 Syrians have been forced to go back home from Lebanon, fleeing bombs, a crisis within a crisis. In Europe, according to the European Asylum Agency, in September of this year, asylum requests from Syrians were fewer than 180,000. Now, we don't know what's going to happen, but many European countries have already decided. They've suspended the assessment of asylum requests. Austria is already thinking of sending people back. In addition, this is a trend we're seeing everywhere in Europe relating to asylum in general. Warsaw, first and foremost, is about to take on board the presidency of the Council, and the Commission doesn't seem to mind this development. Now, we don't know what's going to happen in Syria, but what we do know is that it's time to protect and support the Syrian people, not leave them to their own devices or kick them out. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, the Assad regime has fallen, and it's now time for 100,000 from Syrian refugees and millions across Europe to pack their suitcases and go home, and do so now, because we've seen 30,000 Syrians marching on the parliament. We've seen calls for violence from Syrians in Germany as well, and they should leave the country as soon as possible. This is a clear security risk for those people who want to close their eyes to this in Europe. Assad is history, and therefore there is no basis for any protection status in Europe. We should not for one day longer finance these people with taxpayers' money, and it's an absolute disgrace that Mr. Brunner, an Austrian citizen, is warning against deportation. His own party, the ÖVP, called for deportations and promised this. This is hypocrisy, and we all know these methods. Patriots are clear. It is time to act. Now what we need is to return these people, and we should stop this migration to Europe. Thank you.
Our next speaker, Mr. Madison.
Tere hommikust. Õnneks proua Kallasega saab eesti keeles rääkida.
Good morning, everyone. Luckily enough, I can use my mother tongue and speak in Estonian to Madam Kallas. We are very happy that the regime of al-Assad has fallen. It could have been more democratic. We hope that the future will be more beautiful, bright, democratic. But historically, this extreme Islamist movement has not been the most peaceful. But let's talk about democracy. Everyone, every society will choose their own way, make their own decisions. It's their decision. But I am interested in the concrete actions. We say that we want to support Syrian future, but what will we do when the new regime will start killing Christians? We want to support them in words, but in actions, what will we do? What will we do when millions of Syrians are fleeing the new regime because it's not as nice as we hope? Will we protect our borders? Will we do like we did with Turkey before, paying Turkey for closing the borders? What are our plans, B, C, D, if everything is not as bright as we talk about and hope today?
You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dear High Representative, good to see you here in our plenary, Kaja Kallas. De val van het Assad-regime brengt zowel opluchting.
Assad's regime has fallen, and many are relieved, but there's much uncertainty for the Syrians. Will the country be in a period of instability? Will it be a time of rebuilding and stability? Will it mean that people can come back to Syria safely? New Syria has some benefits. They have now lost the Russian influence that kept Assad in power, and last week the European Union requested a peaceful transfer of power. Meanwhile, the UK, the US, Israel and Turkey continue to act, and they're talking with the rebels that brought down the regime. In Russia and in China, well, we cannot let them decide the future of Syria. The European Union must assume its responsibilities, discuss with Syria so that the real rebuilding can begin, not just for stability and safety, security in Syria and for the whole region, but for Europe's safety and security as well. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Mr. Orlando.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, President. High Representative. The sudden fall of the dictator in Syria after so many years in power has taken place, and the European Union now needs to support civil society in Syria, and also civil society in the diaspora. We need to push for a democratic transition, guaranteeing the rights of minorities and women. Turkey has played an important role in this phase, but we need to call on them to stop attacking the Kurds. We need to make sure we have a presence on the ground to ensure that civil society can be properly involved in the transition. They're the only ones who can move the country towards democracy. We also need to look out for the rights of Syrians in Europe. We need to maintain their guarantees. There's also a UN resolution which needs to be respected. And we need to do that so that the Syrian people can decide their future. Syria has been the arena for much conflict, and that has nothing to do with the rights of the Syrian people. Thank you.
Thank you. You have the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, President. The 8th of December 2024 marked the end of the reign of the Assad family. Syrian refugees, for the first time, are contemplating and dreaming about returning to their country with the scene of so much torture. Syrian territory has been a scene of clashes, interventionism, and we need to support the Syrian people in their aspirations for freedom, dignity and justice, respecting all of the diversity and religious minorities in the country. Many people are seeking to divide. But with a neighbour, Israel, we have a neighbour, Israel, which is bombing Syria. And how can this be taking place? How can we dream of a future when so many Western countries are trying to define their priorities and prepare Syrian refugees to return to their country? We need to support Syria in this fight. Thank you.
Firmenich, you have the floor.
Die Berichte aus Syrien sind
Reports from Syria are alarming. HTS, the branch of al-Qaeda, together with other terror groups, has taken power, and there is a threat of Sharia law there. Europe is looking to these Islamists with sympathy, and that's a pretty bad thing. International law is important, and everyone's talking about international law, but it doesn't seem to go for Western allies or Western states. Israel is bombarding many areas of Syria and has occupied a buffer zone in Syria. NATO member Turkey, together with IS militias, is bombarding the Kurds. The EU constantly talks about the values of our community, but we have lost all credibility. Our foreign policy is a bloody farce. Thank you.
El señor Burgallo.
Mr. Bugallo.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you, President.
Representative, este Parlamento y este...
This Parliament and this EU frequently is just a talking shop. And when Bashar al-Assad fell, we knew precisely what needed to be done. Stability, multilateralism that is realistic, that doesn't abdicate rights. Europe is the best in terms of humanitarian aid in the world. And now the Syrian people deserve more than just hope. Having a future does not mean just waiting. We cannot just consider this a moral or geopolitical imperative. It is an imperative for the EU and our values. Now, what is happening in the region, we can see that there is not peace in this land, but it's also a question of security for us of Europe. The High Representative yesterday presided over the Council, and what we've seen is that the crisis there increases fundamentalism. The region has victims on a daily basis, and this European Parliament stands with those victims. But we also need to be clear-sighted in terms of the threat globally that could involve European lives. And the European Parliament must be attentive to this as well. In international policy, we cannot... I would like to just give a quote.
To let it be. Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Glucksmann, you have the floor.
Merci. Madame la Haute Représentante.
Thank you. High Representative, colleagues, Aleppo, Homs, Damascus, the Syrians are celebrating the end of a brutal regime. Yes, the future is uncertain. I share some of the concerns that we've heard here. But let's be honest, colleagues. Who was listening to the Syrians when they were dying under the bombs of Putin or under the yoke of Assad? Just a few people tried to support their demonstrations in foreign offices across Europe and across the West. People were talking about re-establishing relations with Syria. People were having their photos taken next to the butchers in Syria, and the left seemed not to disagree. Everything was done to prevent the Syrian rebels being visible, but I want to ensure that their voices are heard. Since 2011, given the enormous crimes that were committed by Assad, Putin and Hezbollah, and the Iranian regime, Syrians felt abandoned. The country is devastated. There are constantly mass graves being discovered. Hundreds of thousands disappeared in Assad's jails. Syria needs massive support to rebuild its country. Let's be there for them this time. Colleagues, this call needs to be heard. We weren't there to help Syrians in the war that they fought, but we have to be there for them as they build peace. Thank you.
Our next speaker, Mr. Tioni.
L'horreur et la noirceur.
The horrors of the Assad regime are giving place to another regime with significant repression. How could we not want this country with all its religious minorities? How can we not wish long-lasting peace and harmony for them? And we need to focus on that hope. But I am significantly worried about our continent with the threats that surround us and that are also here on the ground. Because of jihadists, it's possible that we may see an opening up of Syria, and we should encourage that, but we should remain clear-minded. Now, we have a devastated Middle East, and this is something that we need to take into consideration.
Very much. Our colleague Kanko is the next speaker.
Thank you, President. Madam High Representative, we all agree that Assad was bad news. Bad news for Europe and certainly bad news for the people in Syria and in the region. We should all know that the HTS is no better news. Not for us and not for them. The fall of Assad means less fuel for Hamas and Hezbollah, less power for Iran, a new balance with Russia in the region, and an opportunity for something else. That good news is only one side of the coin, because the tyrant is replaced by Islamist jihadists. That remains a threat. So while we can indeed rejoice in the fall of Assad, we cannot see any promising future for Syria, and even less so for women, Christians, religious minorities, and Kurds today. We must be vigilant. How will you navigate between optimism and realism in this situation? How will you work with our transatlantic allies? The danger of European jihadists who went to fight us always try to come back to Europe. For that, we must protect our borders and be clear they must stay there. Madam Kallas, your Christmas menu doesn't look very good. When we look at the situation in Ukraine, at the crisis in the Middle East, at the situation in Africa, you really have a lot on your plate. But in this Parliament, we stand ready to work for you, for security and for a better future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, dear colleague. Mr. Guetta, you have the floor.
Ce n'est malheureusement pas impossible.
Unfortunately, it's not impossible that new Syrian leaders could end up repopulating the prisons and imposing the hijab. But how can we be certain about that? Why should we rule out the idea that they want to rebuild their country rather than plunge it into further bloodshed? Why should we believe that they aspire to impose in Damascus the theocracy that is falling apart in Tehran? We've got these people who are opening up the doors of the prisons, and Syrian men and women are supporting them because their victory has marked the end of the rule of brutality in Syria. Nothing can be excluded, but for the moment we're seeing that Putin is not invincible, and there is a suspicion that the strange levels of concern that have accompanied the freeing up of Syria are just an effort to forget the shameful alliance that brought the Kremlin, Iran and the far right together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President. In Syria, with the fall of tyranny, the dreams have come true for many people who protested during the Arab Spring, a democratic movement in Egypt, in Libya, in Syria, but also in Europe, in Spain, where many of us mobilized on the 15th of March in that same year. We've seen so many missing people, so many people tortured. Now we see a stage of hope. But there are also risks. What can we do here in Europe? First of all, we should not turn our back on Syrian refugees, as the far right are calling for. We should also demand that the Islamists respect minorities and women, but also from Turkey we need to have respect for the Kurdish people. And also Netanyahu's expansionist plans. They've even talked about reaching Damascus in their government, a violent plan, bombing. We cannot stifle the dreams of freedom, and we need to respect Syria's territorial integrity, and that's also our responsibility because Europe, this continent, is supporting Netanyahu.
Monsieur le Président,
President, High Representative, colleagues, the consequences of the fall of the Assad regime are geopolitical, but they are also of a human nature. There is a real risk of this country continuing to splinter. The West with the Russian, the Kurdish in the northeast, and so on and so forth, with the Christians in the main cities. And of course, then there are the Daesh fighters throughout the country. Now, there is a calm transition, at least in appearance thereof, and yet the country is in chaos. Tension is all over. On the ex-Syrian army, the pro-Turks are fighting in the north. Murders continue. Pillage continues. And then the Americans are bombing Daesh bases. We shan't be disingenuous. We must be prudent. HTS has done nothing to prove that they have taken distance with the Islamist terrorism, and we know that there is the imperialist issue related to Turkey. All you have to do is speak with our Cypriot friends. Children, women, minorities will be the main victims of this regime that has not yet stated its name. Now, the High Representative must have a strong voice, an observation mission to remain calm in the country until we know better what precisely is taking place there. Thank you.
Give the floor to Ms. Insir for 1 minute and a half.
Madam High Representative, colleagues, at last the brutal regime of Assad has been consigned to the dustbin of history, and the dream of democracy that sparked 2011 revolution is emerging. For a democratic Syria to thrive, it must embrace diversity and equality, accommodating the hope of all its people, whether it is Arabs, Kurds, Christians, Sunni, Shia, women or men. And foreign powers like Turkey and Israel must cease their unlawful actions that violate Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity. International law must apply equally to all. I urge the EU to raise its voice against this violation, particularly as the upcoming US under Trump may disregard established global rules in this process. As we speak right now, Turkey, alongside its SNA terrorist allies, is attempting to invade the Kurdish city of Kobane, a site pivotal in defeating ISIS. The international community's understanding of the situation in Syria is being tested right now. It is unacceptable for a NATO member and an EU candidate to engage in such behavior. A united front from the EU and NATO can send a clear message to Turkey about the limits of tolerance. To avoid missteps, the EU must support democratic allies, particularly the Kurdish-led autonomous administration of North and East Syria, which has fought for freedom and played a crucial role in combating ISIS. High Representative Kallas. Syria stands at a crossroad. Dialogue among all factions, especially democratic ones, is essential, and Turkey and Israel must halt any violation of Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity.
Thank you very much. Now I give the floor to Mr. Holvenji for 1 minute.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Chair. Dear High Representative, dear colleagues, something great has happened in Syria. However, many experiences, personal meeting on the spot with Syrians warn me caution. What's next? They must have a clear picture. Any decision influences millions, whether they return or leave the country. No room for false promises. Return of Syrians to their homeland is essential for all. But the country is in ruins, and the leadership will say is more than uncertain. The EU needs to be aware of what is its own capacity to do and what not to do. Concrete. It is essential to have a dedicated summit to take a general overview of realistic possibilities. Currently, we have pressing humanitarian appeals to answer. EU sanction of Syria cannot anymore be the barrier of delivering aid. Guarantees are needed for the Christians, as well as Kurds and others will enjoy the full freedom of existence. Dear colleagues, we have to stand up for the rights of Christians, Kurds and other minorities. It is not a religious, but it's a humanitarian rights question. Respect of the rights of all parts of the Syrian society is absolutely a key. As soon as the conditions are there, dialogue is needed together with the regional actors for reconstruction. There is no return otherwise. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I give the floor to Mr. Weimers for 1 minute.
Thank you, Chair. High Representative Kallas. Millions came from Syria to Europe. Now the regime has fallen, and countries want to return migrants there. But their hands are tied by the EU court, which is legislating from the bench, overruling democracy. The EU court makes it virtually impossible to send back migrants. They require the entire country to be safe, no degrading treatment, no risk of suffering serious harm. Colleagues, do we meet these conditions ourselves? Sweden, with its bombings, shootings and humiliation crime by migrant gangs, sure doesn't. Take back control. Member states must change the legal framework. If left-wing governments block reform, don't be surprised if member states start ignoring the EU court. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I will give the floor to Ms. Yar for 1 minute.
Thank you. Madam Vice President, dear colleagues, the fall of Assad's regime not only shows that the oppressed do not give in to the lack of freedom in Syria, in Ukraine, anywhere. It has also delivered a significant blow to Russia and Iran, and within 2 weeks reshaped the dynamics in the region. However, this is no guarantee of stability. As we know, the direction of HTS remains uncertain, and the EU needs to stay vigilant. Madam Kallas certainly knows. It must lead with principles, values, but also pragmatism, including insisting on closing Russian bases. The EU should explore diplomatic channels, but must urge the new leadership to prioritise security, the base of all negotiations, and then build upon it, upholding the minority rights, gender equality and freedom of belief. Because this is more than geopolitics. Syrians deserve freedom, they deserve stability and a chance to rebuild their own country without fear and oppression. Stable and free Syria is the goal for Europe as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I give the floor to Ms. Zovko for 1 minute and a half.
Thank you, dear President, Madam Vice President. Despite the joy that can be expressed in celebrating the toppling of barbaric and cruel regime, the current situation in Syria gives us no reason to rejoice. Indeed, we should refrain from giving benefits of doubt to the individuals that overthrown the Assad regime. A lot of them are war criminals and represent a major threat to minorities, especially Christians, Druze and Yazidis. There should be no whitewashing, and we should not suddenly change our stance only because the Assad regime fell. Radicalism will not be solved with radicalism. The current promises made by the rebels towards minority will not be kept for long. The meeting of the new Minister for Religious Affairs in Syria with Christian leaders to promise them protection should not divert our attentions. Many years ago in Bosnia, Ottomans came and gave them the same permit. And then, in the meantime, they were burning churches, expelling people, and this is what is happening in Bosnia and Herzegovina with Christians, and let alone in Syria. So don't be naive. Finally, appoint somebody who will treat in an External Action Service and in the Commission, who will be a full-fledged commissioner or a representative who will go and protect Christian minorities wherever they live and not make just some symbolic role in the External Action Service. We have to take care of the religious minorities, or either we cannot be fully responsible for what is going on in the Middle East. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now I give the floor to Mr. Kremer for 1 minute.
Dear colleagues, dear High Representative Kaja Kallas, the fall of Bashar al-Assad was one of those rare occasions of unexpected good news these days. Good news because nobody will miss this bloody dictator, and good news because his fate sends a clear message to despots all around the world that suppressing your own people while relying on Vladimir Putin will land you nowhere but in Russian exile. But there is a problem with this unexpected good news, namely that it was exactly that, unexpected. Once again, like in Afghanistan, we found ourselves fully taken by surprise, fully unprepared to deal with the situation. And we are lacking the presence on the ground. We are lacking the local expertise. We are lacking diplomatic contacts. And yet, what do we hear from the Commission? Are rumours about cutting down funding to the European External Action Service, cutting down on our diplomatic muscle. And I'm sorry, but that's like a milk farmer selling all his cows to make space for more milk. What we need is more diplomatic muscle, more diplomatic presence in the ground, not less. We need more EAS also to support you in your task over the next years. I'm a big fan of good news, but I don't want them to come unexpectedly ever again. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I give the floor to Ms. Thysint for 1 minute.
Alto Rappresentante.
High Representative, colleagues, the jihadist groups have toppled the dictatorship, the brutal regime of Assad. This is a further worsening of the already delicate situation in the Middle East. And again, Europe is at risk of losing its soul. They have conquered Syria with their Islam domination, but we know that Islam wants to expand, infiltrate, and oppress. Now, we know this is not a faraway risk. It is currently being imported, and it's already been imported, the cultural model that is incompatible with our Christian roots, but not only. It also threatens our security and our identity. We want a free Europe, or one that is circumvent to Sharia. Without this control, without a control to play, our civilization is under threat. There is no future without identity. Thank you.
Now I give the floor to Mr. Bondra for 1 minute.
Thank you very much. So let me start by commending the High Commissioner statement for calling the stability and territorial integrity in Syria. Indeed, it is in our interest to see a stable Syrian government that brings an end to the civil war and halts the migration wave to Europe. While the EU is, and I would say rightly, not engaged militarily in Syria, our diplomacy must work to prevent the new government from forming the alliances with the Iranian regime. Iran, along with its proxies, is becoming notably weaker, which is a positive development for the region. And Syrian government that distance itself from any collaboration with terrorist organizations would be a critical test to achieving the stable Middle East. Finally, religious and ethnic minorities in the region, like Yazidis, Kurds and Syriacs, have faced a terrible persecution in the past. The EU must therefore ensure that any serious recognition of the new Syrian government is contingent upon its rigorous respect for the right and protection of those minorities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I give the floor to Mr. Eroglu for 1 minute.
Ja, sehr geehrter Herr Vizepräsident.
Well, yes, thank you, President. Thank you, High Representative. Well, I think it's good news for the European Union that Syria has been freed from its murderous dictator. He was also the biggest drug producer and drug dealer that the Middle East has ever seen. Now, we've got more good news. The militias are going to be dissolved and they're going to become part of the Syrian army. We want to see that the Syrians are doing what they say. So that's good. I think we need to be very clear about what we want in Syria as well. We need to help. We need to ensure that medicines are supplied, schools are rebuilt, agriculture is rebuilt, and we need to help Syrians to rebuild their army as well so that they can defend their borders. And then once we have the rule of law in place, then we'll be able to see what comes next. I mean, that's what we should be doing rather than all this nonsense that we've heard today in Parliament. Thank you.
Por 1 minuto y medio.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to give the floor to Mr. López Istúriz.
13 años de guerra civil.
Thank you very much. 13 years of civil war, a bloody regime. But we need to see what happens with the new government in Syria. Now, you understand, I have my suspicions and I have my doubts vis-à-vis the rebel groups that form part of the new government. And also, Europeans are at the origin of this problem. People don't talk about that, but, you know, this is how the lines were traced. Look at the Kurds, for example. The main problem is us. So I'm very happy to see what the High Representative is saying, to see that we have been present in meetings with Arab ministers, sending diplomats to Damascus. It really looks like we are taking the responsibility that we have had over this for the past 200 years. Now, unfortunately, in this Parliament, we have those we always hear the far right talking about immigration from the very first second and the far left talking about Israel. Can you just stop focusing on these obsessions? And Israel is defending itself, and in the south of Syria as well. It's incomprehensible, these ridiculous obsessions that these two sides of the House have. Syria needs solutions, and Europeans need to be there for the Syrians. So the thousands of people of whom the far right are talking about, to help those people because they're being persecuted. Sorry, you have a blue card from Mr. Gadi. Would you accept it?
Θα μιλήσω ελληνικά.
I will speak Greek. Dear colleague, this is not just an obsession. If you go to Cyprus, you will see what is actually going on the island. There is a huge problem. Hundreds Syrians have waved the flag of the Free Russian Army in all Cypriot cities, and this could convince you about the real issue at hand.
Si quitarle ni un segundo del problema que usted está mencionando.
Well, you mentioned this problem. What I am saying, the priority is to solve the problems in Syria so that this does not happen again, and not wasting time with these issues. And we also need to resolve the issue of immigration. And we also look at what's happening in Syria and how the people are suffering. And we've had 13 years of civil war and persecution as well. That's what I've been talking about, and not focusing so much on the issue of immigration.
Now I will give the floor to Mr. Di Rupo for 1 minute.
Madame Callas, Mrs. Callas, I'm sure you've seen the images on CNN. The journalist Kalissa Walt went into an Assad prison and frees a prisoner who had been closed in total darkness for 3 months. Now, the man initially was clearly frightened, but then when he saw the light of day, he realized that he was getting his freedom back. But the fact is, nothing has been concluded in Syria. However, we as Europeans have a great interest in supporting the transition. It's crucial to neutralize the Islamic State, and we need to ensure a fair and stable transition for everyone, including ethnic and religious minorities. We need to ensure that women are truly free. And whatever the skeptics say, we need to open up a constructive dialogue with Ahmed al-Shara and his Prime Minister. That's in our interests as the free world. This is a challenge, but it's an obligation that we face. And it's a heavy and difficult task for you, Madam High Representative.
Now I will give the floor to Mr. Laszlo for 1 minute.
In Syria, the forces of the Assad regime have been defeated. He himself fled the country. Nonetheless, the situation is fragile. The outcome of the power struggle is unpredictable, and we must be prepared for every scenario. In this situation, the EU has 3 main interests and responsibilities. First, I ask the European Commission and the External Action Service to keep a very close and direct line of communication with the leaders of the Christian community. They may become a target very quickly and very easily. If they are targeted, they can only count on Western help, and we need to stand ready. Second, aid sent to Syria should not end up in the hands of radical groups. It would be indefensible towards European citizens if we helped the consolidation of yet another oppressive regime. And third, our aid should aim to create the circumstances that make the swift and safe return of refugees possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now we'll give the floor to Mr. Rausen for 1 minute.
Dank u wel, voorzitter. Beste collega's.
Thank you, President. Colleagues. Now, we wish the troubled Syrian people a future of hope. The big question really is, will the new rulers ensure this? The HTS rebels promised to protect the rights of minorities. Meanwhile, they would like to introduce Sharia law. So this is all extremely contradictory, and it's difficult to reconcile it. Now, Sharia generally shows very little mercy to those who think differently. Christians in Syria are therefore extremely afraid, very afraid, and the situation is highly uncertain for them. So it should be our priority to care for the minorities and make sure that that is the case in our new interactions with the new rulers, because there is only a hope for Syria if there will be room for the church to continue to spread its words, its good news. So the message of Christmas is that that God sent his son to earth for the forgiveness of sins.
Andrews for
Thank you, Mr. President, Madam Callas and colleagues. I'm just so pleased that Assad is gone. I campaigned against the policy of normalisation. Just last July, 8 EU member states proposed that we would reopen the Syrian embassy in Brussels. That initiative now looks embarrassing. But at its core was the mistake of trying to put EU migration management policy ahead of what might be in the interests of the wider Syrian people. And the reality is that we turned our back on the Syrian opposition. We turned our back on those who fought for justice and against impunity. We turned our back on those who are haunted by the gulags and the prisons and the torture centres. Now, for once, we have an opportunity to invest in reconciliation, in reconstruction of this wonderful country. And for the first time, we have an opportunity to really prioritise the interests of the people of Syria in all their diversity. A lot of analysis has focused on Iraq and Syria, but the better example is Sudan. There was a change of leadership there in 2019, and we failed to invest in reconciliation, the growth of democracy, in development. We turned our back on Syrians before. Let's not repeat that mistake. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I will give the floor to Mr. Lopatka for 1 minute.
It is positive to see the end of this brutal terror regime in Syria. Now we must support Syrians in an orderly transition to a stable, functioning and democratic state. We must maintain continuous dialogue and keep the channels of communication open with the provisional government. And therefore, it was absolutely the right step of the new High Representative, Kaja Kallas, to send a high-ranking diplomat immediately to Damascus. We can assist in the rebuilding of institutions and democratic state structures. And we need there an inclusive government and a peaceful transition in order to support the rebuilding of society and the economy and to reunite families and communities. We must encourage and assist Syrians in Europe to return to their homeland. 98,000 of them are in Austria. The majority are young men. They are needed in the country to rebuild the society and the economy.
Thank you very much. Now I give the floor to Ms. Temido for 1 minute.
Colleagues, High Representative, following more than 50 years of the Assad's control of Syria, Syria was jubilant with the end of this regime that used chemical weapons against its people. And I'd like to say there is no but when it comes to the end of a cruel dictatorship. However, With the fall of the regime, the HTS movement, which is prescribed by the United Nations, is a cause for concern. Syria has a new transition government, and we know that the risks of violence remain. There are opposition movements, and there are many vulnerable religious minorities. Israel has bolstered its presence in the Golan Heights, and Turkey has established an advantage over Kurdistan. Now, the Syrians that are outside of the country, the diaspora hope to come back. But it's not possible to think of this in the short term, to put an end to asylum policy. And in the EU, we know there's 1 million Syrians. The Portuguese President Sampaio established in 2014 the Global Platform for Syrio Students. It's a program of bursaries that meant that many children were able to come to Europe and have a future. Now, we know that there have been crimes. We have to protect human rights, establish the institutions, make sure that the peace process is inclusive. Without any of this, there will not be a new phase of hope.
Thank you very much. Now I will give the floor to Mr. Baraut for 1 minute.
Le renversement du régime syrien.
The Syrian regime has fallen, and that has produced chaos in the region. A militia led by a former al-Qaeda and IS leader has imposed itself. Christians may well end up being victims here under the indifferent eye of the international community. There's a new wave of migration being prepared, and Europe, already weakened, won't be able to deal with it. I've heard the colleagues say that we're obsessed by immigration rather than trying to help Syrians, but migration is something that causes problems. We should be obsessed with it. I'm worried about the future of Syria and the Syrian people, but I've been elected to defend the French people and also the people of Europe. Ankara is ready to manipulate this new power, which the Turks have helped to put in place. And they're going to once again use migration and use all the threats that they've got. We need to protect our borders, and also we need to protect persecuted minorities in situ before it's too late. So what is the European plan here? Because the European Union has a remit in foreign policy. So we're listening and we await to hear what you have to say. Thank you.
Now I give the floor to Mr. Bruczynski for 1 minute.
Thank you, Chair. Szanowna Pani Komisarz.
Ma'am, Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen. Most of the previous speakers have expressed their joy and satisfaction at the downfall of the Assad's regime. Of course, any fall of a brutal dictatorship should bring happiness and joy. However, what we see today in Damascus, in Aleppo, and in other regions of Syria should infuse us with joy and relief. I will refer to one of the priests of the Christian churches, a Malachite priest, who said that the feelings that the Syrians feel today is fear and joy. Joy because something new is coming, but also fear of chaos. Christians have been in that region from the times of St. Paul, and they account for 7%. In total, there were 1.5 million Christians there. Today, there are barely 300,000 Christians. I hope that the Assad's downfall will not be an end of Christianity in Syria. And I hope that the gullibility that I have heard in many speeches today, this feeling of being naive and hopeful about the change that the Arab Spring would bring to Northern Africa and to the Middle East, I hope that this will not result in Christians disappearing from the Middle East and it will not lead to the appearance of Islam extremists in Europe.
I will give the floor to Mr. Beke for 1 minute.
Dank u wel, voorzitter, mevrouw de hoge commissaris.
Thank you very much, President. Madam Commissioner, 1 week in the job and an authoritarian regime has already fallen. I think we can only be happy about that. We are happy that Assad's regime has fallen, but we have some hesitations as well. And, you can see the images of the Sednaya prison or listen to the witness testimony from these torture chambers and slaughterhouses under the Assad regime. And perhaps there were other threats. We need to avoid a situation like we had in Iraq after the fall of Saddam, or what happened in Libya after Gaddafi fell. And we don't want to see another Afghanistan either. This means that the EU needs to take on its responsibility. Iran, Turkey and Russia must not benefit from a vacuum of power to impose their influence. We need to help Syria. There are millions of Syrians in the diaspora, and they have a huge amount of hope. And the EU needs to guarantee stability and dialogue. It's not about sending them back today, but we need to put in place a programme together, and that's what we are counting on you for. Thank you.
Mr. Mavridis, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. President. The toppling of the brutal Assad regime is a historical opportunity for peace and stability in Syria and beyond. But what are our clear priorities with overwhelming consensus of this House? First, the protection of minorities, ethnic and religious, particularly Christians and Kurds. Second, jihadis cannot be our partners. To nominate a wanted terrorist as a moderate political opposition cannot fool EU citizens, neither this House. Regarding Turkey, Madam High Representative, after meeting recently the Turkish Foreign Minister, you nominated Turkey as a strategic partner. This is wrong, but fortunately there is time to reconsider. In our campaign against the Islamic State and jihadists, Kurds were our brave partner, while Turkish intelligence under Fidan's orders supply arms and logistics to these jihadists. The Erdogan regime, the occupier of EU territory in Cyprus, is connected with terrorist organizations in the areas, from Hamas to Muslim Brotherhood, from Libya to Syria, while now the attack on Kurds in Kobani is imminent. High Representative, silence is not just morally wrong, but a tragic geopolitical mistake.
Thank you very much. Now we are running a little bit late, and I will want to announce that we are going to close the Catch the Eye first, and secondly ask to the members to stick to the time. And we continue, and I will give the floor to Mr. Siriani for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, President, High Representative, colleagues. The regime fell, and that surprised the major powers in the world. These same powers, with the Hamas terrorist attack, that shows how unstable the intelligence and diplomatic services are because of all of these surprises. Now, it is true that Assad was a dictator, but I think Europe needs to take more distance to what is happening before it celebrates a huge shift to pluralism, specifically when it comes to the role. We need to have prudence when it comes to Turkey, to Putin, and its withdrawal from Syria. That could be shifted to Libya with the Russian fleet in the Sicilian Peninsula, along the Sicilian coast. Now, we should fight, or should make sure that there isn't a fight against all and a migratory flow. Requests for asylum and the policy that has been adopted by many member states, that requires coordination. There is a hope to have a virtuous cycle in Syria. Let us hope it's sincere. We must respect the territorial sovereignty and independence. Our aid should reject any extremism, respect for for international law, as well as the protection of minorities. Thank you.
Floor to Mr. Stier for 1 minute.
Hvala predsjedniče, kolegice I kolege. Pad Asadovog režima je u geopolitičkom smislu snažan udarac Iranu. Naravno da je Rusija također strateški oslabljena.
The fall of Assad is a serious blow for Iran, and Russia is also strategically weakened. Now, whether Syrians remain in Europe will depend on negotiations with the new Syrian regime and also on negotiations with Erdogan. Turkey seems to be one of the big winners from this new situation, and the withdrawal of Russia has caused a vacuum that Erdogan is going to try and exploit. The United States are not going to get more engaged in Syria, and Israel is doing everything to guarantee its security. Now, the European Union needs to act, of course, and I welcome what the EU High Representative said when she talked about doing everything to protect our values and our interests. So that's obviously Christians and European citizens. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, Madam Jalul Muro.
Thank you very much, President. We are witnessing historic events. Assad's dictatorship, especially that of Bashar al-Assad, has ended after so many years. And this has led to many people being mistreated, being isolated, and being tortured. We thought it was impossible. People have been released from prisons, and seeing this must be intolerable for any country in the world. And the protests were oppressed in the Arab Spring in 2011. I call on you. We need to be united, we need to be responsible, and we need to be up to the challenge and focusing on facts and data. Now, if we look at what's happened in Syria and what Israel is doing, this is a breach of international law which is jeopardizing security in the region. But we also need to focus on what happens in the future, question of security, and we need to see improvements there. And Syria needs to have the right to decide and to put in place a democratic system. We need to also respect the dignity of human lives and not focusing on the return of asylum seekers as some countries are promoting in Europe. Now, we need to protect minorities as well, majorities and women. That's another very important issue. This Parliament should not be selective. And also the opposition are secular forces. Not everybody is an extreme Islamist. And we need to have an inclusive government. That's what's most important, and including a focus on women. And Kaja Kallas is doing a huge amount of work at diplomatic level, which are very positive for the European Union, and the EU should be focusing on the Middle East in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
To Mr. Altola for 1 minute.
Arvoisa puheenjohtaja,
Chair, High Representative Kallas, the Syrian people have been suffering for decades. The Assad atrocities have claimed hundreds of thousands of victims, millions have fled. Now we need to allow Syrians to resolve their issues while playing an active role in the creation of a stable and broad regime. The challenge is considerable. Power will be reallocated. It is likely that there will be bloodshed and conflicts having to do with power struggles and territorial claims. It is clear that the third parties that supported the al-Assad regime have been exposed as being weak. They have an interest in meddling with the events. It is essential that we are more aware of what is going on, as with Hezbollah and Hamas. The EU needs to support. What is sure is that Syria will remain under geostrategic pressure for a long time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I give the floor to Mr. Furlas for 1 minute.
Thank you, President. The situation in Syria is not just a matter of geopolitical concern. It's a humanitarian disaster with unprecedented consequences. Millions have fled the country. Hundreds of thousands have lost their lives. This is a very shameful situation. And it's a country very close to my homeland, Cyprus. Of course, as the EU, we welcomed the fall of Assad, but we didn't say how we can protect Christians and other minorities that are endangered and targeted. Russia, Turkey, and Iran are the major actors in a great geopolitical game, but the EU needs to be present. We need to take the lead in this. We need to tackle this crisis from a European perspective. So, dear Commissioner, we will stand by your side in this effort. Just one word of advice. Do not really trust Erdogan and Turkey because they are an occupying force in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I give the floor to Mr. Kelly for 1 minute. Mr. Kelly for 1 minute.
Thank you, President and Commissioner.
Dictatorship was one of the most vicious and most brutal regimes the world has experienced over the last 50 years. Now, as the country is still reeling from the events that have taken place there, the stories of the cruelty that Assad and his father imposed on their own people come to light. The international community should reflect on their actions in Sudan, where limited support for the civilian government played a role in the country's descent into civil war. A vacuum of power now exists in Syria, where the different rebel factions may want to grab as much land and power as they can. It is the time for the UN, the EU and the Arab League to step up and assist the Syrian state in actualising a peaceful transition with fair and free elections where all minorities and religions can be equal. I urge our European partners to demonstrate dignity and compassion towards Syrian refugees. There is still a long journey ahead for Syria, but a great step forward has been taken by the ending of the Russian-backed Assad's reign of terror.
Thank you very much. Now I will give the floor to Mr. Mandel for 1 minute.
Liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen, hohe
colleagues, High Representative Kaja Kallas, welcome to the European Parliament, and I look forward to working closely with you to deal with foreign affairs situations and also the situation of refugees, because these are joined. I mean, I was in Syria a couple of years ago. I've been there several times, and it was clear back then that refugees might want to go home, but there are many armed groups in the region, and people don't really know who they can trust and whether they'll be safe. But clearly, we do have to reassess the migration situation. The Austrian government have done that. Other governments have followed. And we'll see how things go. I mean, what we're seeing in Syria is the fall of a brutal dictatorship, but we don't yet know what's going to happen in the future. We need to support them in spite of the fact that they potentially are Islamists, so that they can rebuild Syria. We have the responsibility, though, to ensure that everyone goes home who can contribute to rebuilding Syria. Thank you.
Now I give the floor to Ms. Bentele for 1 minute.
Dear Vice President Kallas, many important and true things have already been said by my colleagues, and I would like, therefore, concentrate on a topic which was maybe not yet highlighted that much in the debate. I was very pleased to hear that you proposed to the Council to convene an Association Council meeting with Israel. This shows that you are focusing rather on dialogue with Israel and not on ousting Israel, which was lately the very wrong policy of your predecessor. For me, it is shocking to see that the relations between an EU member state like Ireland and Israel can deteriorate to such a point that an ambassador is being recalled. It is high time that the EU set straight its position towards the only stable democracy in the region and to motivate Israel to play a constructive role in the upcoming process, helping to establish a new political authorities in Syria. In this regard, I also very much welcome your announcement to restart a high-level dialogue with the Palestinian Authority. There is currently a big opportunity for the EU in the Middle East to become more than just a donor of humanitarian aid. For example, an enabler for institution and democracy building. I'm strongly convinced that parliamentarian engagement and diplomacy can be beneficial to your efforts. Also, as a former German diplomat, I'm very much looking forward to a close cooperation with you in the next 5 years.
Thank you very much. Now I give the floor to Mr. Tonin for 1 minute.
President, Madam Commissioner, no dictator is internal. A dictator who killed and gassed his own people ran away like a biggest coward. This is the true face of dictators. They take care only for themselves and they destroy the country. Islamists are clearly taking over Syria. The experience of Afghanistan teaches us that we should never ever trust the words of the Islamists. We will judge them by their actions. So there are 3 possibilities. First, further fighting and fragmentation as in Libya. Second, one dictator replaced by another as in Iraq. Or we finally get a new and inclusive Syria. I expect from the EU to tie all our financial and diplomatic assistance to new Syrian authorities strictly to the fulfillment of our core values. This is to resolve conflicts through the dialogue, to establish institutions of state, and to protect religious minorities, especially Christians. The real strength of authorities is not in the number of guns, but in sincere support of the people.
Thank you very much. Now I give the floor to Mr. Sokol for 1 minute.
Poštovani potpredsjedniče, povjerenice, kolege.
Thank you. Madam Vice President, High Representative, colleagues. The regime fell more quickly than we thought. Now, it does not necessarily mean that the new regime will be democratic. We have the rebels have taken control, but they can be described as Islamists. 1.5 million Christians have left the country, and 300,000 are still there, and there are various groups, and this shows that we shouldn't just be euphoric about this. We should use all means we have to put pressure on the new government, but also via Ankara protect minorities. If the new government shows that they are democratic, we should support refugees to return to support their country.
Just to have catch the eye, but we are running out of time, and as you know, we have at 12 the Sakharov Prize. Then we will do only 4 catch the eyes. It will be people who was present all the time during the debate, and especially once per group, per political group. The first one, it will be Milan Sver from the EPP.
Hvala za besedo, gospod predsedujoči. S padcem al-Assada se je zgodil pozitivni.
Thank you very much. Well, we've seen the fall of Assad, and that's a positive thing for the region. It means the end of repression on Syria and the end of links with Hezbollah and the Iranian regime. It was also a defeat for Russia. And also the plan to destroy Israel is less likely to happen as well. So what should the European Union be doing? Well, first and foremost, it should exclude those countries that brought Syria to its current situation from Syria's new era. All democratic forces should be included, the European Union, the United States as well, of course. So that's the first thing. And then secondly, we need to do everything possible to prevent the Afghan model being repeated. The European Union needs to be involved in rebuilding Syria. High Representative, we place great hopes in you to ensure that the European Union can play a greater role. Thank you.
Thank you, President, and welcome, High Representative Kallas. Listening to the whole debate, I must say one thing. I am disgusted by the way some people here talk about people. It's dehumanizing. And I want to have noted that from the far right, the word deportations has been used several times, and I do not want to normalize that. We will only get one chance to get this right. The fall of the Assad regime is not a guarantee for stability, in particular because Turkey and Israel are vigorously pushing their own agendas. So how to convert this situation into an opportunity? Adding to the useful ideas that have been raised by my colleagues, I want to say to the High Representative to consider investing in our very diverse and knowledgeable Syrian communities in our societies. They are very knowledgeable and they can be of help. Also promote and support initiatives to transitional justice, offer direct and indirect peace building and dialogue, and work on the protection of minorities, in particular the Kurds in the north. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I will give the floor to Ms. Langet-Siepen. Catherine.
Yeah, thank you. Ich werde Deutsch sprechen.
I'll be speaking in German. Now, to throw a figure into the room, 54, and then another one, 48. 54 years of an Assad dictatorship. The father of Bashar and Bashar al-Assad. The regime has fallen, but if we hadn't seen such a swift fall, it wouldn't have been possible to call for deportation so quickly. I echo what my colleague in the S&D Tice was saying. It's incredible how inhumanely people speak about humans, as if they don't have their own free will, as if they have to just fall into chaos straight away. It's as if there would be no opposition, nothing in Washington, Paris and Berlin. People are there. We have a democratic plan, and Ms. Kallas, I call upon you, contact the new movements with the experienced activists and speak to people. They don't want things to be decided on their bodies. They don't want to be decided for them what is bad or good. That's my appeal to you, Ms. Kallas. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I will give the floor for Mr. Dostal.
Vážení kolegové, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, as a citizen of a country that, as Czechoslovakia, was supporting Syria, I have to say that I'm very sorry how things turned out. Under both Assads, the regime wasn't ideal, but it was secular, it was stable, and it provided for the functioning of the country. Already in 2009, the International Monetary Fund was praising Syria for growing GDP, lowering debt, and reforms. If we interfere, if we support jihadists, if we support coup d'etats, if we have sanctions, it only leads to hundreds of thousands of deaths and a ruined economy. Israel and Turkey have turned Israeli sovereignty into a joke. What have we done to Syria? And when we say we, I mean the EU and NATO member states. We have our share of blame in how things turned out in Syria and in the region. No wonder people are going to hate us. Mrs. Kallas, let us help them. Let us not support coup d'etat and terrorism. Let's support peace. Thank you.
Thank you very much. With this, we end the Catch the Eye. Again, I reiterate that we are running out of time and we are having a short list of Catch of the Eye, and I appreciate the passions of the High Representative. Now I will give the floor to Kaja Kallas, Vice President of the Commission.
Dear President, honourable members, thank you for this debate. I think it was very, very useful. And it is true, and I agree with you, that we can't leave a vacuum in Syria, and we have to avoid the mistakes that we did with Libya, with Afghanistan, and we have to be also there. The future of the country must be Syria-led and Syria-owned, and reflect the Syrian people in all their diversity. Yes, we know that Syria is very diverse, and I agree with those that we don't talk about protection of minorities, but we talk about inclusivity of the government, that, you know, all the groups that you also mentioned in the plenary would be sitting around that table. I agree with those who said that the European Union must be present. And we have already started to have a process to engage cautiously with Damascus, pushing for inclusive and tolerant approach. I see we have a chance here to really impact the region, and we need to follow closely the next steps in the short term. And I've asked the head of delegation to go to Damascus yesterday to have constructive first contacts with the new leadership and various other groups, also the civil society. And we are ready to reopen our delegation, which is the European Embassy, and we want this to be fully operational again. I think this is a very important step, that we will reopen the delegation in Syria to have, like many of you said, really constructive engagement, and to have the input and information from the ground as well. In parallel, EU remains the biggest donor of humanitarian aid to Syrian people, and we stand with the Syrian people through this transition, as we did during Assad's brutal rule. Like I've said, Syria faces positive but uncertain future, and we have to work together with the regional actors. That's why meeting with the Arab countries, the United Nations, United States, but also Turkey, and having the same principles in mind is extremely important to deliver the same messages also to the new leadership, what we want to see. So thank you very much for this debate, and we will continue to cooperate also with the European Parliament. Thank you.
Thank you very much, High Representative. I'm informing you that the vote about the resolution will be in the future, in the coming seasons. With this, we end the debate about the toppling of the Syrian regime and its geopolitical implications and the humanitarian situation on the country.